Putin just lost control. Ukraine launches the offensive he was never prepared for. A Russian tank sits axle deep in Ukrainian mud, engine screaming, going nowhere. Its crew climbs out, shoulders their rifles and starts walking. Somewhere above them, a drone is already watching. By the end of this video, you'll understand why April 2026 didn't just hand Ukraine a battlefield win. It destroyed the one diplomatic card Putin had been saving since December. The most important victory Ukraine has scored recently doesn't show up on any territorial map. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If your army is losing land and soldiers simultaneously, what is the single logical move? Putin didn't make it, and that decision is now costing him on every front at once. Picture the opening weeks of March 2026. Russia has spent months massing tens of thousands of soldiers along the Donbas front. The Kremlin's propaganda machine is humming, state television is running countdown graphics to the inevitable fall of Ukraine's eastern fortress belt. Putin has personally signaled that this spring offensive is the one that finally finishes the job. Then the ground thaws. Eastern Ukraine in early spring isn't a battlefield, it's a slow-motion trap. The combination of snowmelt and heavy spring rain turns the topsoil into something closer to wet concrete. For an army that still runs on Soviet-era doctrine of massed armor and mechanized assault, this isn't a weather inconvenience, it's a strategic catastrophe. Russia's tanks and armored vehicles, the fire support and protection that infantry depends on, grind to a halt across the entire front. And Putin's answer to an immovable tank is not to wait, it is to order the soldiers out of it and send them forward anyway. When the mud stops the machine, Russia sends the men instead. Those men walk directly into the most drone-saturated kill zones in the history of modern warfare. Ukrainian FPV drones, ground robots, and mid-range systems are waiting at every approach. The spring offensive, designed to shatter Ukraine's eastern defenses, instead handed Ukraine a free target range. The tactical picture that emerges from March and April 2026 is not of a Russian army advancing, it is of one being systematically consumed. Start tracking that image. Everything that follows in this video explains how it got this bad, and why it is going to keep getting worse. The numbers for April 2026 are in, and they are unambiguous. Russia recorded its first net territorial loss since August 2024, the month Ukraine launched its Kursk incursion and seized over 1,000 square kilometers of Russian soil. That August 2024 comparison matters. Kursk was a Ukrainian shock offensive, a deliberate and dramatic land grab designed to force Russia to redeploy. What's happening now is different in character and arguably more significant in implication. Ukraine isn't raiding Russian territory this time, it is methodically liberating its own, and doing so at a pace that has visibly shaken Russia's operational planning. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Ukraine outpaced Russia by 116 square kilometers, roughly 44.7 square miles, of net territory in April alone. That follows a March in which Russia's vaunted spring offensive produced a grand total of 23 square kilometers of gain across 31 days of fighting. 31 days of war, 23 square kilometers. That is not an offensive. That is stagnation. Contrast that to March 2025, when Russian forces were capturing approximately 12.9 square kilometers of Ukraine every single day, according to the Kyiv Post. Run that math and the conclusion is stark. 2 days of fighting in March 2025 produced more Russian territorial gain than the entire month of March 2026. The momentum has not just slowed, it has reversed. Ukraine is now liberating territory at a rate of roughly 3.87 square kilometers per day. The spring offensive has not stalled, it has collapsed, and Ukraine is the one setting the operational tempo now. 1 year ago, Russia was a different kind of problem for Ukraine. In March 2025, Russian forces were advancing at roughly 12.9 square kilometers per day. That is not a blitzkrieg, but it is a grind that compounds. Territory lost stays lost, supply lines stretch, and Ukrainian defenders get pushed into increasingly difficult positions. The math of attrition was working in Moscow's favor. Now, run the same math on March 2026. Russia's spring offensive, the one built up for months, the one backed by tens of thousands of massed troops, the one Putin's state media called inevitable, produced 23 square kilometers across the entire month. Not per day, for the month, 2 days of last year's war outweigh 31 days of this year's. That single comparison does more analytical work than any map graphic. It tells you that the Russian military isn't just slowing down. It is operating at a fraction of its previous capacity while burning through soldiers at record rates. The ISW has been tracking a steady decline in Russia's rate of advance since November 2025, driven by Ukrainian ground counterattacks, mid-range strikes disrupting Russian rear areas, the February 2026 cutoff of Russia's illicit Starlink access, and the Kremlin's own decision to throttle Telegram, which, in a dark irony, damaged Russian military communications more than it damaged anyone else. The research on exactly how much each factor contributed is still being pieced together, but the cumulative effect is not in dispute. Russia's operational engine has been running on fumes for months, and April 2026 is where it finally ran dry. Here is the part that almost nobody is talking about. December 2025 was the month Russia's territorial gains began their free fall. It was also, not coincidentally, the exact month Putin was positioning himself for a new round of peace negotiations. That timing is not accidental. It is the core of Putin's strategic logic. The ceasefire table, from Moscow's perspective, is an extension of the battlefield. You negotiate from the position your army holds. Putin's calculation in late 2025 was straightforward: hold enough Ukrainian territory through the winter, launch a spring offensive that adds to it, then arrive at the negotiating table in a position of demonstrated strength. Land captured equals leverage extracted. Putin didn't just lose ground in April, he lost the argument he was building for the table. What actually happened is the precise inversion of that plan. From December onward, Russia's daily gains collapsed. The spring offensive that was supposed to consolidate Putin's negotiating hand instead exposed how thin that hand always was, and Ukraine, which had been preparing its active defense strategy for exactly this window, didn't give Russia a single month of momentum to point to. The forward-looking implication here is significant. Peace talks in the second half of 2026, if they happen at all, will not feature a Russia that can point to fresh territorial gains as proof of inevitability. They will feature a Russia that lost ground in April, is hemorrhaging soldiers faster than it can replace them, and whose generals are actively lying to their own president about the state of the war. That is not a strong negotiating position. That is a collapsing one. In February 2026, a Russian recruit named Ivan gave an account of his military experience to United 24 media. He had signed a contract, passed his medical checkups, and was asked 2 days later whether he was ready to deploy to a training base. He said yes. What followed was 5 days of training exercises, then 5 days of waiting for a force rotation, then the front line. Medical screening plus 10 days of preparation. That is the full education of a Russian frontline soldier in 2026. Ivan wasn't describing an exception, he was describing the system, a military that is losing more soldiers every month than it can recruit. The UK Ministry of Defense confirmed March was the 4th consecutive month Russia fell short on recruitment, cannot afford to spend time on training. It needs bodies, and it needs them fast. 10 days between civilian and combat. That is not an army, that is a conveyor belt. The consequences of that conveyor belt show up directly in the casualty figures. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that Russia burned through 35,351 soldiers in March 2026 alone, a record that eclipsed the previous worst month, December 2025, by over 350 casualties. On April 29, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense recorded 1,470 Russian losses in a single day. Multiply that by 30 and you arrive at a projected monthly total of 44,100. Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov has set a target of 50,000 Russian casualties per month by the end of 2026. At the current trajectory, that number is not a stretch goal, it is a forecast. Russia is feeding an increasingly effective Ukrainian kill zone with soldiers who had 10 days to prepare for it. The outcome was never going to be anything other than what we are now seeing.
What do you do when the man running your war refuses to hear bad news? You tell him good news instead, and you keep telling him until the gap between the story and the reality becomes impossible to bridge. That is the situation inside the Russian military command structure right now, and it is accelerating every problem we have already discussed. Valery Gerasimov, chief of the General Staff of Russia's armed forces, went on record on April 21st, claiming that Russia had captured 80 Ukrainian settlements and 1,700 square kilometers of territory during the spring offensive. He specifically described March and April as months of continued Russian advance, 34 settlements and 700 square kilometers taken, he said. The ISW's verified numbers say otherwise. Gerasimov was not mistaken. He was lying. Whether that lie was crafted to deceive the outside world or to protect Gerasimov's own position inside a system that punishes bearers of bad news is almost beside the point. The operational consequence is the same either way. Putin is making decisions based on a battlefield picture that does not exist. He is allocating resources, setting objectives, and projecting timelines against a version of the war that his own generals have fabricated. This is not a new dynamic in Russian military history, but it is reaching a critical threshold. A commander who is systematically misinformed cannot course correct. He cannot adapt to conditions he does not know exists. And adaptation, as Ukraine has demonstrated throughout 2026, is precisely what determines who controls the operational tempo. Russia's command failure is not just a political embarrassment. It is a direct military liability that compounds with every passing week.
For most of this war, drone warfare on the Ukrainian front operated at two distinct ranges. Close in, FPV drones, fast, cheap, and lethal, dominated the front lines, turning every approach into a kill zone. Far out, long-range drones struck deep inside Russia itself, hitting oil infrastructure, military depots, and command facilities hundreds of kilometers from the front. Between those two ranges sat a gap, and for a long time, Russia exploited that gap to keep its rear areas, supply lines, command posts, air defense systems relatively functional. That gap no longer exists. Ukraine has fielded a new category of mid-range drone that flies up to 200 kilometers behind the Russian front line, further than FPV systems, cheaper than long-range strategic drones, and precise enough to hit specific military infrastructure. The effect on Russian rear area operations has been, according to the Kyiv Post, decisive. Russia's rear was its last safe zone. Ukraine just eliminated it. Supply convoys moving toward the front are being intercepted or destroyed before they arrive. Command posts that previously operated with relative impunity are now primary targets. Air defense systems in occupied territories are being struck, and every air defense node that falls opens a corridor for long-range drones to push even deeper into Russian-held infrastructure. It is a compounding effect. Each mid-range strike.
Here is a number that reframes everything. 96% of Russian casualties in the current phase of the war are being inflicted by drones. Not artillery, not infantry engagements, not tank battles. Drones. That figure means that the vast majority of the tens of thousands of Russians dying every month are being eliminated before they ever get close enough to a Ukrainian soldier to constitute a real military threat. Think about what that means for Russia's entire strategic doctrine. The human wave assault, mass infantry pushing forward under artillery cover, absorbing losses until something breaks, was already a brutal and costly approach. Against a drone-saturated battlefield, it is not just costly, it is functionally obsolete. The kill zone begins kilometers before the front line. Soldiers walk into it the moment they leave their staging areas. Russia is not fighting Ukraine's army. it is feeding Ukraine's machines. And Ukraine's machines are getting more capable by the month. Ground robots now operate alongside FPV drones on the front lines, creating overlapping fields of fire that infantry cannot navigate without catastrophic losses. Mid-range drones are cutting off the reinforcements and supplies that might otherwise give those infantry units a fighting chance. The kill zone is not a line anymore. It is a volume of space that extends in every direction Russia needs to move. Russia's answer to this has been to send small infiltration units behind Ukrainian lines to claim territory for propaganda purposes.
Ukraine is not running a grand counteroffensive. That distinction matters more than most coverage acknowledges. A sweeping counteroffensive, the kind Ukraine attempted in 2023, requires massed armor, breaching fortified lines, and accepting significant losses to reclaim large chunks of territory quickly. Active defense is a fundamentally different strategic logic, and it is the framework Ukraine has built its entire 2026 campaign around. The principle is precision over mass. Ukraine identifies where Russian forces are weakest, most logistically exposed, or least prepared, and strikes those points with calculated force. Mid-range drones disrupt the rear. FPV systems and ground robots dominate the front. Seek and destroy units clear gray zones. Each action forces Russia to react, to shift reserves, to make operational adjustments under pressure. Those adjustments create new gaps. Ukraine exploits the gaps. The cycle compounds. Ukraine is not trying to break Russia's line. It is trying to break Russia's decisions. This strategy is being reinforced by structural changes inside Ukraine's military that run directly counter to what is happening on the Russian side. Where Russia is cutting training time to feed its casualty rate, Ukraine is increasing it, prioritizing unit cohesion and tactical flexibility over raw numbers. Where Russia depends on external equipment supplies that are becoming harder to secure, Ukraine is expanding its domestic defense industry to reduce that dependency, building the specific systems its active defense strategy requires, rather than waiting for foreign procurement cycles. The forward-looking trend here points clearly toward 2027. As Ukrainian units become more cohesive and its domestic production scales, defense industry analysts expect meaningful output increases through late 2026 and into 2027. The gap between Ukrainian tactical execution and Russian tactical capacity is going to widen further. Active defense today is laying the foundation for something considerably more assertive tomorrow.
Picture a fortress. It sits on a peninsula, connected to the mainland by a single bridge and a narrow land corridor. Its garrison depends on supply lines that run through both. Cut the bridge, destroy the corridor, and the fortress doesn't fall immediately, but it begins to starve. Every week that passes without resupply, the garrison gets weaker. The fortress that looked impregnable starts to look like a liability. That fortress is Crimea, and Ukraine has been cutting its supply lines one strike at a time since well before April 2026. The peninsula has been under illegal Russian occupation since 2014. In the 12 years since, Putin has treated it as the geographic and symbolic crown of his entire Ukraine project, the proof of concept that territorial seizure works, the naval base that anchors Russia's Black Sea ambitions, and the political trophy that justified everything that followed. Losing it would not just be a military setback, it would be an existential humiliation. Crimea is not just territory. It is the argument Putin has been making for 12 years. Ukraine understands this, which is why the campaign against Crimea is not a frontal assault. It is a methodical isolation. Ships supplying the peninsula are being struck. Military infrastructure and logistical hubs are under sustained drone attack. Air defense nodes are being systematically degraded, the same compounding pattern we saw applied to the Russian rear on the mainland.
Russia entered 2026 with a plan. Mass soldiers, launch a spring offensive, take the Donbass, and arrive at the negotiating table from a position of demonstrated strength. What actually happened is the precise inversion of every part of that plan. April 2026 delivered Russia's first net territorial loss in 20 months. record casualties that outpace recruitment, a command structure built on lies, and a battlefield being systematically dismantled by Ukrainian drones, precision strikes, and a strategic doctrine that turns Russian weakness into Ukrainian opportunity. Putin doesn't have an answer for any of it. If you want to understand the next chapter of this war, and specifically what Ukraine's isolation campaign means for the future of Crimea, make sure you watch our dedicated Crimea video. The full picture of how that siege is being executed and what it means for the broader war is covered there in detail.